I am Hamish Macbeth, and welcome to the Crimson Noir.
The morning in Loch was hushed, wrapped in a thick silver-grey mist that clung to the surface of the loch like a damp woolen blanket. It was the sort of silence that PC Hamish Macbeth deeply appreciated. The silence of a village still asleep, and more importantly, the silence of a telephone that hadn't yet begun its insistent, shrill demands from headquarters in Strathbane. Hamish stood knee-deep in the cold water at the edge of the reeds, his long, lanky frame nearly invisible against the fog. His ginger hair was tucked under a battered tweed cap, and his hazel eyes were narrowed in intense concentration. Beside him, Lugs, the hairy mongrel of indeterminate breed and unparalleled laziness, sat on a dry patch of moss, watching with an expression of mild boredom. With a flick of his wrist, Hamish cast his line. He was currently engaged in the delicate art of borrowing. A breakfast salmon from a stretch of water, theoretically reserved for the paying guests of the local estate. To Hamish, the fish belonged to the Highlands, and since he was the only policeman in the Highlands currently awake, he felt he had a primary claim. The peaceful stillness was abruptly shattered by a sound that didn't belong in the glen, the aggressive, high-pitched whine of an engine being pushed too hard. Hamish groaned, his shoulders slumping. Through the thinning mist on the road above, a sleek, sunshine, yellow Italian sports car appeared, looking as out of place as a flamingo in a coal mine. It screeched to a halt near the old stone bridge, and out stepped a man who seemed to have been manufactured in a different century, and certainly a different country. He was dressed in a pristine white linen suit that was already wilting in the Highland damp. His hair was slicked back with enough pomade to seal a boat hull. This was Mr. Boat, Quentin Davenport, a lifestyle influencer from London who had recently bought the derelict weaver's cottage and transformed it into something he called an artisanal sanctuary. "I say, you there, constable," Davenport shouted, his voice carrying clearly across the water. He was waving a manicured hand frantically. Hamish slowly waded toward the shore, expertly hiding his fishing rod in a thicket of gorse as he went. By the time he reached the road, he had adopted his most vacant, slow-witted expression. He looked at Davenport with the wide, blinking eyes of a man who had only just discovered the concept of fire. "Is there trouble, sir?" Hamish asked, his Highland drawl becoming twice as thick and twice as slow as usual. "Trouble? It's a catastrophe," Davenport snapped, pacing back and forth on the verge. "My meditation deck. Someone has painted a grotesque caricature of a sheep on my yoga platform in bright blue. It's an assault on my aesthetic chi. I pay an exorbitant amount of council tax, and I expect, nay, I demand protection from these local hooligans." Hamish scratched his head, looking down at his scuffed boots. "A blue sheep, is it? Well now, that's a strange thing indeed. The sheep in these parts are usually white, or a sort of muddy grey, if the rain's been heavy." "Don't be obtuse, Macbeth," Davenport sneered, his lip curling with the typical arrogance of a Sassenach, who viewed the locals as decorative scenery rather than human beings. "It's vandalism, primitive, rural vandalism. I suspect that ruffian at the hardware store, or perhaps the postman, they've been looking at my renovations with quite a lot of envy." "Envy?" Hamish repeated softly, his mind already drifting back to the salmon he'd left behind. "Well, Mr. Davenport, I'll certainly be keeping an eye out for any men with blue fingers. But you must understand, things move a bit slower in Loch. The mist, you see, it gets into the brain." "Clearly," Davenport muttered, checking his gold watch. "I have a live stream in 20 minutes. I expect a full report by tea time. And do try to look a bit more official. You look like you've been dragged through a hedge." Hamish watched the yellow car roar away, leaving a lingering scent of expensive cologne and burnt rubber in the air. He sighed, whistling for Lugs, who emerged from the bushes with a smug look on his face. The mist was beginning to lift, revealing the dark, jagged peaks of the mountains. Hamish felt a familiar weight in his stomach, the hunger for his morning coffee, and the sinking feeling that his quiet day had just been marked for death. He didn't know yet that the blue sheep was the least of Loch worries, but the Highland air was turning cold, and the silence of the loch suddenly felt less like peace and more like a held breath. The yellow sports car had long since vanished around the bend of the Loch road, leaving only a faint blue haze of exhaust to settle over the damp heather. Hamish sighed, adjusting his cap and whistling for Lugs, who emerged from the gorse looking thoroughly unimpressed by the morning's disruptions. The poached salmon remained hidden in its cool, mossy nook. Hamish decided it was better to leave it there for a moment, until the artisanal sanctuary had quieted down. He began the slow trek back toward his small police station, his mind already drifting toward the comforting hiss of his stove and the rich, dark aroma of a fresh pot of coffee. In Loch, a blue sheep was a nuisance, but a cold kitchen was a tragedy. He had barely reached the edge of the village, where the grey stone cottages huddled together against the Highland wind, when he saw Archie McLean, the local handyman, waving his arms frantically from the pier. Archie's face was the colour of a boiled turnip, and his breath came in short, ragged gasps that suggested he had run the entire length of the waterfront. Lugs immediately sat down, sensing that any further walking was about to be interrupted by someone else's crisis. Hamish, man, you've got to come quick," Archie shouted, his voice cracking with a mixture of terror and a strange, morbid excitement. "It's the Sassenach, the 1 inches the white suit. He's not doing any more yoga, that's for certain." Hamish felt a sharp pang of annoyance. His breakfast was slipping further away with every frantic wave of Archie's hands. "Is he having a fit about his blue sheep again, Archie? I've already heard the man's grievances once this morning." "No fit, Hamish," Archie whispered, leaning in close enough for Hamish to smell the faint scent of early morning whiskey on his breath. "He's at the old sheep dip, the one behind his fancy cottage. He's face down in the muck, and he's wearing a pair of those bright blue silk pajamas. He looks like a discarded marionette, so he does." Hamish's hazel eyes sharpened, the deceptive sleepiness vanishing for a fraction of a second before he remembered to look appropriately bewildered. "The sheep dip? That's a strange place for meditation, surely." He followed Archie up the winding path that led away from the village and toward the artisanal sanctuary. The mist had lifted just enough to reveal the jagged peaks of the mountains, which seemed to frown down at the scene below. When they reached the old stone sheep dip, a relic of the village's working past, that Davenport had insisted on keeping for its rustic charm, Hamish saw that Archie had not been exaggerating. Quentin Davenport lay sprawled across the edge of the pit, his expensive blue pajamas stained with the dark, oily residue of the dip. His head was submerged in the shallow, stagnant water, and his manicured hands were clawing at the mossy stones in a final, futile gesture. Beside the body lay a discarded can of bright blue spray paint, the same shade, Hamish noted grimly, that had been used to vandalize the yoga platform. It was a bizarre and humiliating end for a man who had spent his life obsessing over his aesthetic chiff. "Don't touch anything, Archie," Hamish commanded, his voice gaining a sudden, quiet authority. He crouched down beside the body, Lugs sniffing tentatively at a nearby clump of nettles. Hamish didn't need high-tech forensics to see the problem. There were no signs of a struggle, no muddy boot prints other than Davenport's own polished loafers, and yet something felt fundamentally wrong. The man's neck was twisted at an unnatural angle, and a small, silver whistle, the kind used to call a dog, was clenched tightly in his teeth. Is he dead then?" Archie asked, hovering nervously a few yards away. "Aye, Archie, he's very dead," Hamish muttered, rising slowly to his full height. He looked around the quiet glen, his gaze lingering on the shadows of the nearby trees. The silence of the loch had returned, but it was no longer the peaceful hush of a Highland morning. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of a crime scene. Hamish felt a wave of profound weariness. A murder in Loch meant only one thing: the imminent arrival of Detective Chief Inspector Blair from Strathbane. It meant sirens, shouting, and a complete end to Hamish's quiet, productive laziness. He looked at the dead man in his blue pajamas and sighed. The Sassenach had finally managed to leave a lasting impression on the village. But it wasn't the kind he had intended. Hamish reached for his radio, his heart heavy. The peace was shattered, and the circus was about to begin. The quiet of the glen, which had only just begun to settle back into its ancient rhythms, was violently torn apart by the hysterical wail of sirens echoing off the steep granite walls of the surrounding mountains. Two white police rovers, splattered with Highland mud and driven with an aggression that suggested a high-speed chase through the centre of Glasgow, tore up the narrow track toward the weaver's cottage. They skidded to a halt in a cloud of exhaust fumes and gravel, inches from where Hamish stood with lugs. The doors flew open, and Detective Chief Inspector Blair hauled his substantial bulk out of the passenger seat. His face was already a dangerous shade of magenta, his small, piggish eyes darting around with a mixture of contempt and professional greed. Behind him trailed Detectives Anderson and Higgins, both looking as though they would rather be anywhere else than standing in a damp Highland field before lunch. Macbeth, Blair bellowed, his voice loud enough to scatter a parliament of rooks from the nearby larch trees. What in the name of all that is holy have you done now? I get a report of a drowning in a bathtub, and I find you standing over a man in his nightie in a sheep dip. Is this your idea of a quiet morning? Your lanky streak of misery? Hamish smoothed his ginger hair and adopted an expression of profound, wide-eyed bewilderment. He looked at Blair as if the DCI were a particularly complex mathematical equation that he hadn't quite grasped. Bathtub? Is it, sir? No. This is a sheep dip, Mr. Blair. Very traditional. Mr. Davenport was very fond of the local heritage, though I don't think he intended to become part of it quite so permanently. Blair stomped over to the edge of the stone pit, his heavy boots crushing the delicate wildflowers that Davenport had spent thousands of pounds importing from a boutique nursery in the south. He stared at the body of the lifestyle influencer, his lip curling in disgust. Look at him, silk pajamas and a silver whistle, dressed like a complete lunatic. And what's this? A can of blue paint? It's an open and shut case of a tragic accident. The fool was out here, vandalizing his own property for insurance or attention, tripped in the dark, and broke his neck in the muck. It's pathetic. He was complaining about a blue sheep earlier this morning, sir, Hamish offered mildly, his voice dropping into a slow, rhythmic Highland drawl. Said someone had painted his yoga deck. But if he was the one with the paint, it's a strange thing he'd be calling the police to report himself, isn't it? Blair whirled around, jabbing a thick, nicotine-stained finger into Hamish's chest. Don't you start with your logic, Macbeth. I know how your village types work. You probably saw him out here, gave him a fright, and watched him tumble in. Or better yet, Blair's eyes narrowed as they landed on Archie McLean, who was still trembling behind a row of gorse bushes. Who's the local ruffian, you? Step forward. Archie stumbled into the light, clutching his cap so tightly his knuckles were white. I just found him, sir. I'm the handyman. I was coming up to fix the artisanal water feature. Handyman, eh? Blair sneered, circling Archie like a shark in a cheap suit. More like a hitman for the local preservation society. You didn't like the fancy Londoner changing the village, did you? You had a row, you pushed him, and you dropped the paint can to make it look like an accident. Anderson, get the cuffs. We found our man before the coffee's even cold. But, sir, Hamish intervened softly, looking down at his scuffed boots. If Archie had pushed him, there'd be scuff marks in the moss, and Davenport's silver whistle is still in his mouth. It's almost as if he was trying to call for someone or something right at the end. It's a bit of a mystery, surely. Blair let out a roar of frustration that made lugs retreat behind Hamish's long legs. Mystery? The only mystery here is how you've managed to stay in a uniform for this long. I don't pay you to have theories, Macbeth. I pay you to stay out of the way while the real police handle the heavy lifting. Now, take that flea-bitten mongrel of yours and go secure the perimeter. And if you see a journalist, tell them DCI Blair has already made a breakthrough. Go on, get moving. Hamish bowed his head, the picture of a defeated, slow-witted constable. Yes, sir. Whatever you say, Mr. Blair. I'll just be securing things. As he whistled for lugs and began to walk away, his internal monologue was far from defeated. He knew Archie hadn't done it. The man didn't have the stomach for murder, let alone the coordination to frame a scene. The silver whistle and the blue paint were pieces of a puzzle that Blair was too arrogant to see. Hamish needed to get back to the village. He needed to find out who Davenport had been calling. And more importantly, why a man obsessed with beauty had died in such an ugly, calculated way. Hamish walked away from the clamour of the crime scene, his long, lanky frame casting a lonely shadow against the damp heather as he descended toward the village of Loch. Behind him, the shouting of DCI Blair echoed through the glen, a series of barking commands that Lugs punctuated with a single, skeptical huff of his breath. Being sidelined by the real, police was a familiar indignity, and one that Hamish usually embraced with the quiet enthusiasm of a man who had just been handed a free afternoon. However, the sight of Quentin Davenport, face down in a pit of oily chemicals, remained burned into his mind like a persistent smudge. He needed information, and in the Highlands, information was rarely found in a forensic kit. It was steeped in teapots and served with a side of dry, judgmental scones. He made his way first to the post office, where Mrs. Gallagher presided over the mail with the sharp-eyed intensity of a hawk watching a rabbit hole. The shop was small, smelling of old paper, dust, and the faint, sweet scent of lavender water. Hamish leaned against the counter, looking thoroughly defeated and more than a little dim-witted. He pushed his peaked cap back on his ginger hair and let out a sigh that suggested the weight of the world was currently resting on his thin shoulders. A terrible business up on the hill. Mrs. Gallagher, Hamish murmured, his voice dropping into a slow, rhythmic lilt. DCI Blair is convinced it's Archie McLean. He's got the handcuffs and everything. It's a sad day when a man can't fix a water feature without being accused of murder. Mrs. Gallagher peered over her spectacles, her mouth thinning into a hard line of disapproval. Archie McLean hasn't the wit to kill a fly, let alone a Londoner, in silk pajamas. Hamish Macbeth. And you can tell that red-faced baboon from Strathbane, I said so. Davenport was a nuisance. I, with his artisanal this and his aesthetic that. But he was a man with deep pockets and even deeper secrets. Hamish blinked slowly, adopting a look of profound confusion. Secrets, is it? He seemed very open about his yoga and his blue sheep. What else would a man like that be hiding in a weaver's cottage? Mrs. Gallagher leaned over the counter, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial hiss. The mail, Hamish. It tells a story if you know how to read the envelopes. For the last month, he's been receiving legal letters from a firm in London. Very aggressive-looking things. And then there were the parcels. Expensive cameras, high-powered microphones, and enough recording equipment to start a television station. He wasn't just meditating up there, he was spying. He had cameras hidden in the trees, watching the path and the loch. He told me he was capturing the raw essence of the North, but I think he was capturing things people would rather stay hidden. Hamish felt a familiar prickle of interest at the back of his neck. A lifestyle influencer with a penchant for surveillance was a very different beast from a harmless yoga enthusiast. He thanked Mrs. Gallagher with a mournful nod and headed next to the Highland Curry House, where Mr. Patel was busy polishing the front window. Mr. Patel was a man of few words but long memories, and he had a clear view of everyone who entered or left the village. A bad business, Hamish, Mr. Patel said, not looking up from his work. The Englishman, he came in here last night, very agitated. He didn't want food. He wanted to know if I had seen a large, hairy beast roaming the hills. He was clutching that silver whistle like it was a holy relic. I told him we have many beasts in the Highlands, mostly wearing police uniforms, but he didn't laugh. He looked terrified. A beast? Hamish scratched his head. Did he say what kind of beast, Mr. Patel? He said it was silent, Mr. Patel replied, finally stopping his polishing. He said it had been watching him from the shadows of the old weaver's shed. He was convinced it was a sign or a stalker. He was going to live stream it this morning to show his followers the dark side of the glen. Hamish stood on the pavement, Lugs leaning heavily against his leg. The pieces were beginning to shift. Spying equipment, legal threats from London, and a beast in the shadows. Davenport hadn't been vandalizing his own deck for fun. He had been marking a territory, or perhaps trying to scare away something, or someone he had seen through his expensive lenses. As Hamish turned toward the Loch Hotel, hoping for a cup of coffee and a word with the staff, he realized that the Sassenach had stumbled onto something far more dangerous than rural boredom. The blue paint wasn't an aesthetic choice. It was a desperate signal. The damp chill of the Loch afternoon seemed to seep through the very stones of the village, turning the air into a heavy, grey curtain that smelled of peat smoke and salt. Hamish walked with a deceptive slouch, his hands deep in the pockets of his uniform jacket, while Lugs trotted along with a newfound spring in his step, sensing that his master's mooching was nearing a destination with better biscuits than the post office. Hamish's mind was a whirl of blue paint and high-powered microphones. He needed a perspective that wasn't colored by village rivalry or post office gossip. He needed the cool, detached eye of the landed gentry, and in Lochduff, that usually meant a visit to the Halberton Smythe estate. He found Priscilla Halberton Smythe in the stables, her golden hair pulled back into a sensible ponytail, looking far too elegant for a woman currently elbow-deep in horsetack. The scent of hay and expensive leather was a welcome relief from the cloying perfume Davenport had favored. Priscilla looked up as Hamish approached, her blue eyes narrowing with a mixture of amusement and genuine concern. She knew that look on Hamish's face, the one that suggested he was playing the fool while the wheels of his mind were turning at a frantic pace. "I hear the village's newest resident has decided to take a very permanent dip in the local heritage, Hamish," Priscilla said, her voice smooth and melodic. She paused her polishing and leaned against a stall door. "And I imagine Blair is currently trying to fit poor Archie for a noose, while you wander around looking for a lost button. Archie's currently the primary suspect in a peasant revolt." Hamish sighed, leaning back against a wooden post. Lugs immediately collapsed onto a pile of dry straw, his eyes closing. But Davenport wasn't just doing yoga. Priscilla, Mrs. Gallagher, says he was receiving legal threats and buying enough surveillance gear to monitor the entire Highlands. He was scared of a beast in the shadows. He had a silver whistle in his mouth when I found him. Priscilla's expression grew thoughtful, her fingers tracing the edge of a leather bridle. Quentin Davenport wasn't a lifestyle influencer. Hamish, not primarily. My father met him at a gallery opening in London last year. He was a professional blackmailer who used his aesthetic captures to catch the wealthy in compromising positions. He called it social commentary, but the bank accounts called it extortion. That weaver's cottage wasn't a sanctuary. It was a blind. He chose Lochduff because several high-profile families from the south have been quietly buying up land around the glen for private retreats. Hamish straightened, his hazel eyes losing their sleepy glaze. Blackmail. That would explain the legal letters. But who would he be watching here? The locals have nothing worth stealing, and the gentry are too clever to be caught by a man in a yellow sports car. Perhaps not all of them, Priscilla noted, stepping closer. There was a rumour that a certain member of Parliament, a man with a very delicate reputation and a penchant for expensive, illegal Highland game, had been seen staying at a lodge near the Black Loch. If Davenport caught him poaching, or worse, the fallout would be catastrophic. And Hamish, there's something else. That silver whistle? It's a silent whistle, the kind used for highly trained protection dogs. Davenport wasn't calling a beast. He was trying to signal his own security, or perhaps someone else's. Hamish took a slow, deep breath. The pieces were beginning to click into a much darker pattern. Davenport hadn't been an arrogant interloper. He had been a predator who had suddenly realized he was being hunted. The blue paint wasn't a prank. It was a marker, perhaps a way to identify a specific location for a drop-off or a warning. And the beast wasn't a Highland myth, but a very real, very silent threat that had been watching the weaver's cottage from the darkness of the trees. "You've a sharp mind for the dirty laundry of your own class, Priscilla," Hamish said with a small, grateful smile. He knew he had the key now, but he needed to prove it before Blair processed Archie's confession. He needed to find the footage Davenport had captured, and he needed to do it without Blair's heavy-footed detectives trampling over the evidence. As he turned to leave, Priscilla caught his arm, her eyes lingering on his for a second too long. "Be careful, Hamish," she whispered. "If this involves the people I think it does, they won't just shout at you, like Blair. They'll ensure you simply disappear into the mist." Hamish nodded, his face grim. He whistled for lugs and began the long walk back toward the loch. The rain was starting again. A fine, biting drizzle that obscured the peaks and turned the glen into a place of ghosts. He had the motive secrets worth killing for. But he needed the killer to step out of the shadows, and for that, he was going to need a very specific kind of bait. The rain had thickened into a grey, impenetrable curtain by the time Hamish trudged back up the slope toward the weaver's cottage, his boots squelching rhythmically in the peat. The blue paint on the yoga deck was already beginning to smear under the onslaught of the Highland weather, turning the artisanal sanctuary into a miserable, streaked ruin. As he approached the police cordon, the sound of DCI Blair's voice cut through the damp air like a rusted saw. Blair was standing by the back of a police rover, his face a triumphant, pulsating purple as he loomed over Archie McLean. Archie was sitting on the bumper, his head in his hands, looking utterly defeated. Higgins was standing by with a pair of heavy regulation handcuffs, ready to snap them shut. "There he is. The village genius returns from his walkabout," Blair bellowed, spotting Hamish's lanky silhouette. "You're too late, Macbeth. We found the smoking gun, or in this case, the blue sleeve. Anderson, show him the trophy." Detective Anderson stepped forward, holding up an evidence bag containing a torn fragment of heavy navy blue wool. It was unmistakably a piece of a local fisherman's jersey, the kind worn by half the men in Loch, including Archie. "Found it snagged on a rusted nail right by the sheep dip," Blair sneered, his chest puffing out with unbearable self-importance. "And would you look at that? Old Archie here has a tear in his sleeve exactly that size. He was struggling with Davenport, the fabric caught, and over the Englishman went. It's open and shut. I'll have the paperwork finished before the pub opens." Hamish stopped, his hazel eyes fixed on the blue scrap in the bag. He adopted his most vacant, wide-eyed expression, scratching his ginger head with a slow, deliberate motion. "It's a grand bit of detective work, sir," Hamish murmured, his Highland drawl becoming thick and syrupy. "A very blue bit of work indeed. But I was just wondering, Mr. Blair, did you happen to notice the paint on the yoga deck? The bright blue paint?" Blair rolled his eyes, his patience clearly at its limit. "Of course I noticed it, you fool. Davenport was out here painting his own property, like a lunatic, before Archie pushed him. What does that have to do with the sleeve?" "Well now, sir," Hamish said, stepping closer to the evidence bag and pointing a long, unhurried finger at the wool fragment. "If Archie had been struggling with a man who was holding a wet can of blue spray paint, the kind that's all over Davenport's pajamas, and the stones of the dip, don't you think there'd be at least a tiny speck of that paint on this torn sleeve? Wool is a terrible thing for catching wet paint." "So it is." Blair's triumphant grin flickered for a split second. He snatched the bag back and squinted at it, his face darkening. The blue wool was perfectly clean, save for a few strands of white animal hair. It could have been dry, Blair barked, though the conviction was leaking out of his voice, like water from a cracked bucket. "But the paint was fresh this morning, sir," Hamish countered gently, his voice a model of humble apology. "Davenport was shouting at me about it not 2 hours before he was found. And there's another thing, Mr. Blair. Look at those hairs on the fabric. They're too long and too stiff for a sheep. They look remarkably like the fur of a very large, very expensive white dog. The kind a member of Parliament might use for flushing out deer in the deep woods." Blair whirled around, his piggish eyes narrowing, as they landed on the pristine white interior of Davenport's cottage. "What are you talking about, Macbeth?" "Davenport had a poodle, not a hunting dog." "Aye, sir," Hamish agreed, his gaze drifting toward the dark shadows of the trees where Davenport's hidden cameras were likely still recording. "But the poodle was locked inside. This scrap of wool didn't come from Archie's old jersey. It came from a decoy, a bit of cloth planted to make us look the wrong way. If you look at the tear in Archie's sleeve, you'll see the edges are frayed and old. This scrap in your bag has a clean, sharp cut, as if it was snipped with a pair of tailor's shears. Blair let out a roar of frustration, snatching the handcuffs from Higgins and throwing them into the mud. I don't have time for your tailoring lessons. If it's not the handyman, who is it? You're suggesting a conspiracy involving MPs and hunting dogs. You've been breathing too much peat smoke, Macbeth. Oh, I'm sure you're right, sir, Hamish said, bowing his head in simulated defeat. I'm just a simple village policeman. But perhaps we should wait for the forensics team to check the cameras Davenport had hidden. I'm sure they'll show exactly who was wearing the blue wool when the beast came out of the woods. As Blair stomped off toward the cottage, shouting orders to Anderson to start searching the trees, Hamish let out a long, quiet breath. He had bought Archie some time, but he knew the beast wasn't a dog, and the killer wasn't a simple vandal. The blue paint had been a marker for a drop-off that had gone terribly wrong. He needed to find that recording before someone else did, and he needed to do it without the heavy-footed DCI, realizing that the real evidence was currently sitting in a hidden compartment of a yellow sports car. The heavy Highland rain continued to batter the roof of the weaver's cottage, the drumming sound masking the heavy-footed stomping of DCI Blair and his team as they ransacked the interior for camera equipment that Hamish suspected was never there to begin with. Hamish stood by the yellow Italian sports car, the bright paint looking sickly and garish against the grey backdrop of the glen. Lugs sat beside a rear tire, shivering occasionally and looking up at his master with a soulful, questioning gaze. Hamish ignored the shouting from the house. He was staring at the driver's side door handle, where a single, microscopic smear of bright blue spray paint sat like a silent accusation. It wasn't on the outside where a vandal would hit it, but tucked into the recessed lip where a thumb would press to open the door. Davenport hadn't been vandalizing his own yoga deck in a fit of narcissistic madness. He had been marking his own property with a substance that would transfer to anyone who touched it. It was a crude but effective silent alarm. Hamish felt a familiar, cold prickle of intuition. The beast Davenport feared wasn't a mythological creature or a stray hunting dog. It was a human predator. And the silver whistle wasn't for protection. It was a signal for a meeting that had turned into an execution. As Blair bellowed at Anderson about a missing tripod, Hamish leaned his lanky frame against the car, his eyes narrowing as he mentally replayed his morning conversation with the deceased. Davenport had been desperate, clutching his aesthetic chi like a shield, but his eyes had been darting toward the old sheep dip long before he ended up in it. The motive wasn't the high-stakes blackmail of a member of Parliament that Priscilla had suggested, though that was likely the bait. The real crime was something far more petty, far more human, and infinitely more dangerous because of its simplicity. It was a past grudge, wrapped in the shiny paper of a London lifestyle. Hamish remembered the way Davenport had flinched when he mentioned the hardware store. It wasn't the local ruffians the influencer feared. It was the arrival of someone who knew that Quentin Davenport was a fiction, a name adopted to escape a debt, or a disgrace that had started right here in the Highlands years ago. He walked slowly toward the back of the car, his long fingers tracing the edge of the boot. In Loch, people didn't forget, and they certainly didn't forgive a man who rose to fame by stepping on the necks of his own kin. The Sassenach persona was a mask, a way to look down on the very people he had once called neighbors. Hamish knelt in the mud, seemingly to tie a loose lace, but his eyes were fixed on the gap between the boot lid and the chassis. There, caught in the seal, was a tiny, dried leaf of bog myrtle, the same plant that grew in abundance around the ruins of a cottage 2 glens over, a place that had been burned out 20 years ago in a tragic accident, involving a young man who had fled to London with the insurance money. The beast was a ghost, a survivor of that fire who had spent 2 decades waiting for the yellow car to bring the traitor home. The blue paint wasn't just a marker, it was a brand. Davenport had realized someone who knew the truth, someone who didn't care about aesthetic, chi, or artisanal sanctuaries was watching him. The influencer had tried setting a trap with his cameras and his silent whistle. But the hunter had been faster. The white hairs on the blue wool fragment weren't from a hunting dog. They were fibers from an old, traditional Highland goat hair sporran. the kind worn only by the most traditional of locals during a gathering or a funeral. Hamish stood up, the rain lashing his face. He now knew the killer was no outsider or high-ranking politician. It was someone who had been helpful, someone who had been invisible in the background of the village for years, nursing a cold, hard ember of resentment. The blue paint on the yoga deck had been a final mocking taunt from the killer, a way to show Davenport that his secrets were literally written on the walls. Hamish looked toward the village, where the lights were beginning to flicker on in the gloom. He had the motive and the identity of the ghost, but he needed to lure the predator out into the open before Blair could ruin the case with another round of incompetent arrests. He needed a rumor, a bit of gossip that would make a ghost panic. The rain had begun to ebb into a fine, clinging har as Hamish made his way back down to the village, his long strides eating up the distance between the weaver's cottage and the harbour. He walked with a deliberate, heavy-footed weariness, a man defeated by the brilliance of DCI Blair's investigation. Lugs trotted alongside, his fur a sodden mess, occasionally stopping to shake himself and send a spray of Highland mud over Hamish's trousers. The constable didn't mind. He was busy constructing a web of words, a gossamer trap made of whispers and half-truths that would carry more weight than any forensic kit ever could. In Lochduff, a well-placed rumour travelled faster than a police radio, and Hamish knew exactly where to plant the first seed. He pushed open the door of the Lochduver Hotel, the warmth of the peat fire and the scent of frying bacon hitting him like a physical embrace. Miss Patel was behind the small reception desk, her face set in a mask of professional disapproval, as she surveyed the muddy trail Hamish was leaving on her clean linoleum. He didn't offer an apology. Instead, he slumped onto a bar stool, looking thoroughly dejected, and let out a long, theatrical sigh that seemed to rattle his very bones. A terrible day, Mrs. Patel, Hamish groaned, resting his ginger head in his hands. A terrible, complicated day. DCI Blair is convinced it's poor Archie, and he's nearly finished with the paperwork. He says the blue wool is the final nail in the coffin. But I'm worried, Mrs. Patel. I'm worried about the invisible witness. Mrs. Patel paused in her polishing of a brass tray, her dark eyes sharpening with interest. An invisible witness, Hamish? Since when does the mist start giving statements to the police? Not the mist, mem, Hamish whispered, leaning over the counter and dropping his voice to a conspiratorial lilt. The cameras. Davenport had them hidden in the birdhouses along the path. Blair thinks they're broken, but I managed to get one of the memory cards out before he started trampling. I've left it back at the station, drying out on the stove. It's a specialized infrared thing, you see. It captures heat. Even if the person was wearing a disguise, it shows their exact height, their gait, and a very specific detail on their right hand, a missing bit of a finger, or maybe a scar from an old fire. He saw the flicker of movement in the corner of his eye. Archie McLean's younger brother, Willie, was sitting by the fire, ostensibly reading a 3-day-old newspaper. Willie was a quiet man, a man who had stayed behind to care for their ailing mother 20 years ago, while Quentin, then known as Rory, had fled with the insurance money from their family cottage. Willie's right hand, currently clutching the edge of the paper, was missing the tip of the ring finger, a souvenir from the night the thatch had collapsed. The station, you say? Willie asked, his voice steady but his eyes never leaving the newsprint. And you're alone there tonight, Hamish. Blair's staying at the hotel in Strathbane, isn't he? Aye, Hamish sighed, standing up with agonizing slowness. Blair hates the smell of wet dog and peat. He'll be back in the morning to collect the evidence and take Archie away. I'll be sitting with the heater and a pot of coffee, watching that footage over and over until I'm sure. It's a heavy responsibility, making sure a man's life isn't ruined by a mistake. Hamish whistled for lugs and walked out into the cooling evening air. He didn't head for the station. Instead, he made a wide detour through the back gardens, moving with a silent feline grace that would have stunned the real detectives from the city. He reached the small, drafty police station and slipped inside through the kitchen door, leaving the lights off. He placed a dummy memory card actually a small, square bit of plastic from a chocolate box, on the edge of the stove and sat in the shadows of the corner. His hazel eyes fixed on the front window. The trap was set. He had offered the ghost a chance to destroy the only thing that could identify him. A chance to protect his brother Archie by eliminating the evidence that didn't actually exist. Hamish sat in silence. The only sound, the ticking of the clock, and the distant, lonely cry of a curlew over the loch. He waited with the infinite patience of a Highland hunter, knowing that the beast would come not with a roar, but with the soft, desperate scratch of a man trying to reclaim a past that had already been burned to ashes. The silence stretched, heavy and expectant, until finally, the front door handle began to turn with a slow, agonizing creak. The handle of the police station door continued its slow, agonized rotation, the metal complaining with a dry screech that seemed to vibrate through the very floorboards. Hamish Macbeth sat perfectly still in the high-backed wooden chair, his long legs tucked back and his breath held in a shallow, disciplined rhythm. Lugs, sensing the sudden shift in the room's energy, had retreated under the heavy oak desk, his hackles raised but his muzzle silent. The door finally gave way, swinging open to admit a sliver of the pale, watery moonlight that had managed to pierce the Highland haar. A shadow detached itself from the night, moving with a desperate, frantic grace toward the black iron stove, where the plastic chocolate box square sat glinting like a real memory card. The figure reached out, a hand trembling with a raw, primal energy. Just as the fingers, the ring finger noticeably truncated at the first knuckle, closed around the decoy, Hamish reached out and clicked on the heavy industrial torch he had been cradling in his lap. The beam was blinding, a solid pillar of white light that caught Willie McLean in its center, like a moth pinned to a board. Willie flinched, his eyes wide and wild, the scrap of plastic falling from his nerveless grip and clattering onto the hearth. On the other hand, he clutched a heavy iron pry-bar, the cold metal reflecting the torchlight with a murderous sheen. "It's a long walk from the hotel in the dark, Willie," Hamish said, his voice a low, melodic vibration that carried none of the deceptive laziness he had projected all afternoon, especially for a man who's supposed to be reading the papers by the fire. "I suppose the news of a heat-seeking camera was just a bit too much for a quiet man like yourself to ignore." Willie didn't run. He slumped against the edge of the desk, the pry-bar slipping from his fingers to thud heavily onto the rug. The fire that had burned in his eyes during the mooching at the hotel had gone out, replaced by a weary, ancient hollow. "He was going to take it all again, Hamish," Willie whispered, his voice cracking with 20 years of suppressed rage. "He came back here with his fancy car and his fake name, looking down at us like we were the muck on his boots. He didn't even recognize me at first. When I went to the cottage to ask for the money he stole from the insurance, the money that could have saved our mother, he laughed. He told me he was an influencer now, and that the past was just poor aesthetic. He offered me £50 to wash his car." Hamish stood up slowly, his tall frame casting a shadow that reached the ceiling. "So you decided to mark him. You painted the sheep blue to show him you knew the truth of the fire. And when he called you up to the sheep dip to negotiate, you were waiting in the shadows with that silver whistle." "He thought he could whistle for me like a dog, Hamish," Willie cried, his chest heaving. "He had that whistle in his mouth, mocking the way our father called the collies. I didn't mean to kill him. I just wanted to scare him, the truth. But he tripped. His heel caught on that silk pajama hem, and he went back into the dip. He hit the stone edge with a crack I'll hear until the day I die. I just left him there. I thought if I planted the blue wool, they'd think it was a village row and leave it be. I couldn't let Archie take the fall, but I couldn't let that memory card reach Blair. He'd see the scar on my hand." Hamish looked at the broken man before him, the brother of his friend, a victim of a 20-year-old betrayal that had finally curdled into homicide. The undercurrent of darkness that always ran beneath the breezy surface of Loch had finally breached the banks. Willie had acted out of a twisted sense of justice, a Highland grudge that had been nursed in the cold and the damp until it became a monster. "You've a good heart for your brother, Willie, but a terrible hand for vengeance," Hamish said softly. He reached for the handcuffs on his belt, the metal ratcheting with a final, clinical sound. Outside, the wind picked up again, whistling through the eaves of the station, like the very whistle Davenport had clutched in his final moments. The arrest was quiet, devoid of the shouting and drama Blair loved so much. It was just two men in a dark room, surrounded by the ghosts of a fire that had never truly gone out. As Hamish led Willie toward the back cell, he knew the hardest part was yet to come, making sure Blair didn't realize that the simple constable had solved the case by lying about a piece of chocolate packaging. The following morning, the Highland sun made a rare, brilliant appearance, turning the surface of the loch into a sheet of beaten silver. Inside the Loch of police station, the air was thick with the smell of scorched plastic and stale coffee. Hamish sat by the stove, his face a mask of weary, wide-eyed innocence, while DCI Blair stood in the center of the room, his chest puffed out so far that his waistcoat buttons were straining for their lives. "It's an extraordinary thing, Mr. Blair, sir," Hamish drawled, scratching his ginger head with a slow, rhythmic motion. "I was just sitting here, drying out that bit of chocolate wrapping I found near the cottage. Thought it might be a clue, you see, when Willie McLean came bursting in. He was so overcome by your psychological pressure at the hotel last night that he started confessing to everything. The fire, the insurance, the sheep dip. He said, your eyes were like two burning coals, seeing right through his soul." Blair's face shifted from a skeptical purple to a radiant, self-satisfied crimson. He puffed out his cheeks and adjusted his tie. "My eyes, eh? I knew it, Macbeth. I told Anderson the silent type was the one to watch. A masterclass in interrogation through sheer presence. It's a gift, really. Not something they can teach you in a village school." "Oh, it is that, sir," Hamish agreed, looking down at his scuffed boots to hide the glint in his eyes. "He was so terrified of your forensic intuition that he even tried to bring me this iron bar. I suppose he thought I was you for a moment in the dark." A terrifying thought, surely. Blair snatched the bar from the desk, his ego now fully inflated. "Right, Anderson, Higgins, get the prisoner in the van. We'll have the press at the station in Strathbane by noon." DCI Blair smashes 20-year cold case and solves influencer murder. It has a certain ring to it, don't you think? "It's a grand ring, sir," Hamish murmured, touching his cap as the detectives began their noisy exit. "They'll likely want to promote you to a chief constable's post in Glasgow for a catch like this. A big city office with no mud and plenty of cameras. It's exactly what a man of your caliber deserves." As the police rovers tore away, their sirens wailing a final triumphant salute to Blair's vanity, the piece of Lochdabuff settled back over the glen like a familiar old coat. Hamish stood in the doorway, watching the dust settle. He felt a sharp pang of sadness for Willie, who would face the law for a crime born of an ancient betrayal. But there was a quiet satisfaction in knowing that Archie was free and the beast was finally laid to rest. "Come on, Lugs," Hamish whispered, the dog emerging from under the desk with a celebratory wag of his tail. "The circus is gone, and I believe there's still a very fine salmon waiting for us in the moss by the bridge." He walked back to the kitchen and retrieved his fishing rod from its hiding place. The station house was quiet, the stove was warm, and most importantly, the telephone remained silent. To the world in Strathbane, Hamish Macbeth was still the lazy, useless constable who had nearly ruined a major case. To the people of Lochduff, he was just Hamish, the man who knew how to listen to the things people didn't say. As he headed back toward the loch, the smell of peat smoke and salt air filling his lungs, Hamish let out a long, contented sigh. The Sassenach influence had been purged, the secrets were buried, and for one more day, he had successfully avoided the nightmare of a promotion. Life in the Highlands was back to its slow, beautiful rhythm, and Hamish Macbeth intended to keep it that way, for as long as the mist continued to rise over the quiet loch.